Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and children of all ages, what did y'all think about the grub? Now, there's plenty of food left. If you leave here hungry, it's your own fault. So if you need to, get up and go over there and grab you something else to eat. And you could eat anything but Mandy Hill's nanner pudding. Because somebody said, well, they need to take it home with them. So they said it was bad and they need to take it home to test it. So I really want to thank everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed yourself. This is what our organization is about. We are a brotherhood. We are a sisterhood. All of us are supposed to be working together to make this organization and do what it can do and to honor our ancestors in the meantime. Remember, this is not about us, it is about them. If we did not have those brave men and women who made the stand they made 160 years ago, we would have had a completely different country. And they made that stand out of bravery and a sense of honor and a sense of duty and a sense of family. And I think that one thing that we do as an organization, and I've heard it said several times, is we are here to protect and preserve our culture that our ancestors brought us up under. Now, I did not introduce him earlier. The reason why I did not introduce him earlier is I get the honor to introduce him now. Now, this gentleman, I must not be a very memorable person because I had to introduce myself to him 3 times before he remembered me. Because each time he would come up and go to shake my hand and introduce himself, I go, I already know you. He goes, I know you? Unfortunately, yes. He is a great source for the SCV. He is some of the knowledge that he has on the foundation of our country is unbelievable, and how this nation was founded. It is my great honor to introduce our Army of Tennessee Councilman, Mr. Carl Jones.
Thank y'all. Great to be here in North Alabama. Keith, I was at the Christmas party last year, and Keith kind of put me on the spot and asked me to be the speaker this year. I thought, well, I'll have to get my hair done. I've never been booked that far in advance before. The next day I went home and checked my birth certificate to see if my last name had changed to Kennedy or Gramling or McClooney or something like that. Because usually, Jason and I were talking about earlier over at the museum, we're the guys they call when nobody else can make it. So, but no, it's great to be here. I love coming to the museum. Sometimes I just make an excuse to come up here and visit Elm Springs. And it's great to be a member of this organization. I believe firmly in everything Jason just said and what we stand for. I believe in our cause, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. I wrote this lecture, this program, whatever you want to call it, in a rush about January of last year. I had been asked to speak at the Sam Watkins or Sam Davis camp in Biloxi, Mississippi. And my wife and I drove all the way down there, and I realized I had left my speech at home. And so I had to rewrite it on the spot, sitting in the cabin on the grounds of Jefferson Davis's property. So in that regard, this has got some historic value to it, even if nothing I say doesn't make any sense. It was written at Jeff Davis's house. But I've been saying for a long time, 18 years I've been in the SCV, and it struck me even before I was a member, when I started kind of coming into, I guess, my awakening with regards to what the South had contended for and what their defeat really meant and how relevant it is to us today. When I started having that awakening, I came to the realization that to understand 1861 to 1865, you first have to understand 1787 and 1788, the year that the Constitution, which formed the voluntary union in 1787, and in 1788, the year that the states ratified it. That is at the root, along with another thing I'm going to talk about, and Jason hit on it, and that is cultural. So let's get into that. The war is over, 1865, we all know that happened. I say the war is over. In reality, the guns had gone silent, but it is my assertion that the war merely entered a different phase, and that it continues right up until the present day. It is a Cold War, and it is a philosophical war rather than a war of violence and combat. In 1866, English philosopher named Lord John Dahlberg Acton wrote to Robert E. Lee from across the Atlantic, from England. And among other things in this correspondence, Lord Acton said that he saw secession not as the destruction, but as the redemption of democracy. And he stated that he regarded secession as the only availing check on the absolutism of the sovereign will. I'm going to come back to that. He told Lee that he had seen in states' rights in the Confederate Constitution principles that would have liberated the world, and he finished this statement by saying that he mourned for the state lost at Richmond more deeply than he rejoiced for that which was saved at Waterloo. The absolutism of the sovereign will, what that refers to is the old ancient tyrannical belief that what the sovereign, be he a king, an oligarchy, a tyrant, whatever you want to call him, despotism, whatever you want to call that form of government. Of course, it's all oligarchy, essentially. But the absolutism of the sovereign will means that the government's word, their will, is final. The American Constitution was a reversal of that. It was founded on the idea, as stated in the 1776 Declaration of Independence, that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever the government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was created, it remains the right of the people given by their creator to alter, abolish, or throw off that government. So we had the absolutism of the sovereign will versus what actually came out of the Philadelphia Convention and formed the Union of States. Lee replied to Lord Acton, saying the consolidation of the states into one vast republic, sure to be aggressive abroad and despotic at home, will be the certain precursor of that ruination which has overwhelmed all of those that preceded it. Every nation that I can come up with, that I can think of in all of world history, at least in recorded history, that has embarked on imperialism and empire has crumbled under its own weight, and often, if not always, under the weight of militarism financed by loose fiscal policy. I think that Lee understood that defeat meant the elevation of a radical party, and that they sought dominance and control over all of the other states. This was a great reversal of the Constitution itself. I also believe that due to the distinct and often contrary cultures of the different sections which made up America from the very beginning, and in the absence of self-government which state sovereignty provided, centralized force and subjugation would be inevitable. George Mason in the Philadelphia Convention made the comment that a singular, monolithic, or nationalized form of government would be insufficient. A central government would be insufficient for America, which was made up of people so distinctly different in their manners, habits, and customs. All right, so let's look at briefly some of those distinctions. You had essentially 4 British folkways that came into America, and a great book. People ask me all the time, what books would you recommend that I read to understand the war between the states? And I tell them, start with a book by Professor David Hackett Fisher called Albion Seed, because it talks about these 4 distinctly different cultures. And that, as you're reading that, when you see the difference, you'll wonder why the founders ever thought to combine these cultures under a government in the first place. I think that war was inevitable if it was a centralized government. And some examples of this, you had New England, which came out of Puritan culture. These people came from the eastern counties of Great Britain, East Anglia, and among their cultural proclivities were, and I'm just going to name a couple. Number one, they came here a lot differently than our people did. When they came, it was sister, brother, mom, and dad. Okay, and they settled into these communities, and they had a communal structure, and family was dictated by the community. Okay, the family structure, how they related to one another, was dictated by the community. And they would often have a constable assigned to every dozen or so families, and his job was to look in on those families and to make sure that they were functioning according to the communal edicts. If any of you remember a famous phrase, it takes a village, that's what they were talking about. They'd have a different view of what a village was than we do in the South. The Southern people were made up of a combination of Cavaliers from Eastern and Southern and Western England, and then later on in the early 1700s to mid 1700s, the Scots-Irish. The Cavaliers were a hierarchical people. Okay, you could it wasn't a blue blood, it wasn't by blood or hereditary type of thing that you could rise to prominence. It was you could elevate yourself to prominence through gaining an education, becoming valuable to the community, landowners, those things like that, which is how a backwoodsman named Patrick Henry, as he acquired more and more education, more and more understanding of things and property, he eventually found himself in the House of Burgesses. But they had a hierarchical structure. And then you had the Scots-Irish that came here, and these were a different breed all unto themselves. They came out of, contrary to popular belief, they were not Irish. They were Scots who had been somewhat exiled to the northern provinces of Ireland. But Scots-Irish is sort of an anglicized term. It often referred also to, on occasions, to the Welsh, to people of the northern counties of Britain, the lowland Scots, and then you have the Highland Scots also that are probably lumped in there as well. But they were a very fiercely independent people. And when they came, it was mom, dad, sister, brother, grandma, grandpa, all the aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews, and they settled down on a common piece of property in the back countries, and they had their own community. They formed their own community. And if some Yankee constable had come around saying, hey, you're not doing this right, they'd have strung him up by his ears. Okay? Sound familiar? In the South, there was always an inherent distrust of government. Now, let me connect some dots for you. If you think that liberalism, as we know it today, might have been born out of Yankee culture, go to the head of the class. You're exactly correct. Of course, by the 1850s, 1860s, you got to mix some Marxism in there as well. But that's essentially where liberalism as we know it today comes from. It is why they cannot leave us alone. They believe that their ideas are so superior to everybody else's that they must inflict them on us for our own good.
Hear, hear.
This has been going on in this country for 400 years.
Hear, hear.
And if you want to go back further, it goes back further, because these same factions that we called rebels and Yankees in the 1860s were called Cavaliers and Roundheads in the English Civil War. They didn't like each other then either, before they even landed on this continent. So you have these distinctly different cultures, and now we're going to try to form a union out of them in the post-Revolutionary War period. How do we do this? Well, the Virginia Plan, which was named in subterfuge, it was called Virginia to fool people into thinking that it was a Southern conservative Virginia plan, but in reality it was based on the Yankee view of community, of government. It called for, among other things, a strong protective tariff, the erosion of state sovereignty. Your governor, if this plan had been passed, would be chosen by the federal government, not by your vote. The feds were going to tell us who our governor could be. I wonder why they want to do that. It also called for a federal veto power over state law. So even before the Constitution was framed and ratified, they were trying to erode the rights of the states. Why? To inflict their view of community onto us through force of arms, through force of law. But thankfully, this was soundly rejected. And what came out of Philadelphia was a federal document. And when I say federal, I don't mean that it mirrored the ideas of those people who were dishonestly calling themselves the Federalists, because they weren't Federalists. That was another example of subterfuge. It was a federal document, meaning that it would include a separation of powers, that the states would retain the right to self-government with all powers that were not expressly or explicitly delegated to the general government. And I emphasize the word delegated because, as my friends Ron and Donnie Kennedy pointed out to us many times and many years ago, delegated does not mean surrendered. If I own a company and I hire you to come answer the telephone at my company, I did not give you a job. I retain ownership of that job. I delegated you certain responsibilities in which I am willing to compensate you for. But if you don't answer the phone, I reserve the right to withdraw that delegation of power. Make sense? Our government was framed to reflect the exact same premise. The separation of powers between the government was key. It was crucial to the flow and to the operation of our government. The 10th Amendment was an example of this, and I'll talk about that later. But this separation of powers and the fact that we had a loose, voluntary confederation, federalism, federal powers, this is absolutely irrefutable. Our detractors can deny and denounce this and dance around all of the issues until the cows come home, but guess what they can't do? They can't prove that wrong because there is no historical proof to support their assertion that we are one nation. We are not, and we never have been, and we were never intended to be. Consider just a few facts from the framing of the Constitution. This was James Madison, who some regard as the father of the Constitution. He was certainly one of the strongest proponents. But he said in Federalist number 39, written to New Yorkers, it's another point I want to bring up. States' rights was not a Southern view. It was an American view. In fact, the New York delegation got up and walked out of the Philadelphia Convention because they thought it was intruding on the rights of the states. They thought this new government would intrude on the rights of the states. So it was not, absolutely inevitable that New York was going to ratify the Constitution. In fact, it only passed ratification by 3 votes. So James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton had to get together, and they wrote a series of essays to try to convince New Yorkers to ratify it. And one of those was Federalist 39. And here's James Madison on the nature of the general government. The proposed government cannot be deemed a national one, since its jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated powers only, and leaves to the several states residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects. Let me put that in plain English. If it's not in the Constitution, the federal government can't do it. You ought to go read Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. You'd be surprised at the things that they can't do, but they are doing. And that is the end result of Lincoln's victory. Here's Madison again from Federalist 39. Each state in ratifying the Constitution is considered as a sovereign body, independent of all others, and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. Now, I've had liberals dance all around and troll. Yeah, he's not saying what you think he's saying there. Okay, how do I misdefine voluntary, sovereign, and independent? What do you think those words mean? The 10th Amendment was, as I mentioned earlier, was the most requested amendment among the Bill of Rights. It wasn't the first. In fact, you could take the Bill of Rights and flip it upside down, and that was the importance of those amendments to the states. The 10th, and if they'd have been released in terms of importance, the 10th Amendment would have been the first. The 9th would have been the second, so forth and so on. The 10th Amendment, if I'm going to go off the top of my head here, so don't hold me to this, but I'm going to be pretty close, paraphrasing. But it says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states themselves, respectively, or the people. In other words, again, if it's not in there, you can't do it. Everything else that is not expressly delegated to the general government is a power reserved to the states. This would include drug laws, education funding, Social Security, all of those. There's nothing in the Constitution delegating for any of those things to exist at the federal level, but they can at the state level. Jefferson called the 10th Amendment the cornerstone of our constitutional system. And moreover, if we go back to the principles that were, and these weren't any novel revolutionary principles that Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. Everything he said there was already codified in the English Constitution, which was an unwritten constitution, but is English common law. So he was, the main point of the Declaration was that the Crown was not obeying its own law. It wasn't that they were establishing some new, like I said, revolutionary doctrine. But he says in there, he recognizes in the Declaration, and all the colonies signed off on this, that it is the right of the people to alter, abolish, or throw off a government that has become destructive of the ends for which it was created. Remember, this is a reversal of the old ancient tyrannical belief in the absolutism of the sovereign will. So what came out of Philadelphia was a union of self-governing states that had created a general government and assigned specific powers to it to act as their agent, primarily dealing in foreign commerce and a common defense. Nothing more. That's all it was supposed to be. In 1798, Jefferson reiterated this in the Kentucky Resolution when he said, "The several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government, but that by compact under the style and title of a Constitution for the United States," not a Constitution of, a Constitution for the United States, They constituted a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government, and that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. That means there is no mandate for a state to enforce or abide by laws or actions taken by a general government that is exercising powers that were never consented to it. Imagine if we followed that doctrine today. In terms of secession, secession was never questioned by anybody until Lincoln. Virginia, Rhode Island, and New York in their ratification instruments. Let me say that again. Virginia, one southern, Rhode Island and New York, two northern states, ratified the Constitution on the premise that we reserve the right to reassume all delegated powers should the new government become perverted to our injury or oppression. Now, if they give that general government powers and then reassume them, what have they done? They seceded. That condition was accepted on the part of all 13 states, and by accepting that condition, it was made universal not only for those 13 states, but for every other state in the future that would come into the Union. The United States, as I said, it could not work as a solitary, indivisible, and singular nation. Couldn't, because of the cultural distinctions. They would not allow it, and the framers and ratifiers knew this, so the union was necessarily voluntary in nature. Now, I could go on this subject. I'm telling you, the proof of everything that I've just outlined here is irrefutable, and it is mountainous. There is no proof to overturn anything I just said. If you find it, you let me know. But I'll tell you what, save your time. It's not there. Okay? But Lincoln, on the other hand, had a different view of government that was frankly un-American. Unlike the founders who created the Union merely to furnish common defense and ensure free trade among the states, Lincoln said, and I want you to listen to this very carefully. I quoted this in a conversation with my friend Ryan Walters on SCV chat the other night, and I asked the panel there, who do you think said what I'm about to tell you? I'll just go ahead and let y'all up front know it was Lincoln. But listen to this. The purpose of government, Lincoln said, was to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the path of laudable pursuits to all, and to afford to all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. This is the leading object of government for whose existence we contend. In other words, in the Lincolnian view, we must take hold of all of this power. We must centralize it so that we can control your life for you. Again, the Yankee view of it takes a village. Their view of liberty is different from ours. They have a collective view of liberty where we hold it as an individual right. So what we had in 1861 was an attempt by radicals in the North to overthrow the government of our founders. Ron said it again on SCV chat the other night. It was a revolution. It was a revolution by the North. They destroyed the Founders Union and replaced it with the Lincolnian Union. Our country is, in fact, as we know it today, was born in 1865. It is the outcome of Lincoln's victory, and it is not in any way similar to the Jeffersonian country of our founders. It was akin to an American version of a European-style revolution. Woodrow Wilson, a progressive, and like I say frequently, depending on what day you catch me on, I would say that Wilson was either the second or third worst president in the history of America. He was terrible, even though he had Southern roots. But he described, he talked about Lincoln's victory this way. He said that the ultimate outcome of Lincoln's victory, of the defeat of the South, and listen closely to this, was that the government, through its courts, is now the final arbiter of the limits of its own power. Okay? So the government, the federal government's own court is the final word on what powers the federal government can exercise. So much for Lincoln's deceitful government of the people, for the people, and by the people. He didn't mean that. That was a facade on Lincoln's part, as was most of what the man ever said. So today we have a unitary system in which we have no representation. You do not have representation in Washington, D.C. You don't. The Constitution allowed representation to be 30,000 constituents for every one representative. Right now, if my math is correct, you have approximately 770,000 constituents per representative. Try getting your representative on the phone. Good luck. So you are not represented in Washington, D.C. In addition to that, there are no limits. They've decided that there are no limits to their own power. They can intervene in your state's marriage laws. They can dictate to your state what you'll teach in your schools. There are no limits. Everything is on the table. But in spite of that, all attention among most American people is on the national elections, and you have in that a constant battle between these two distinctly different cultures, political worldviews. Oh, we'll get our guy in there, and for 4 years we'll dominate them. And then they'll get their guy in, and they'll dominate us for 4 years, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. Meanwhile, you have no representation. There are no restraints on the government. And what we get is a constant but gradual shift further and further and further to the left and away from our founding and away from liberty. And again, to illustrate the fact that you and I have no representation, who's taken down the monuments? Who changed the Mississippi flag? Conservatives, so-called, right? We file lawsuits. Even when we win, are they enforced? No. Because as Ron and Don Kennedy have said multiple times, I always try to give them credit when I steal something from them, but they're right. We are in effect a stateless people. The people in this room are a stateless people. They can come tear down your monument. We've got one out here we're trying to put back up, and there is nobody in your government that will represent your views because you are stateless and you have no representation. Now, I joke around a lot that the war between the states was the only war in the history of the world to have been centered around one and only one cause, if you listen to our leftist friends. Oh, it was every other war under the sun that I can think of had philosophical issues, had economic issues, had religious issues, geographical issues. Countries might be battling for resources, but it's generally a combination of all these things, depending on who you talk to. But not our war. Ours revolved around one word, the only one in the history. And you know what that word is, slavery. That's all of these idiots in academia, no matter what proof you get, that's all they don't know is all about slavery. Well, look, if you want to dumb it down to a one word, I can play that game too. I'll give you my one word cause of the war, Yankees. But in truth, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and thousands of other men, your ancestors included, in a nutshell, what they went to war to prevent was the very monstrosity that you have today. This arbitrary, unlimited Frankenstein of a government that bears no reflection whatsoever of the intent of our founding generation. Your ancestors interposed their own lives between our rights. We talk about they were fighting for their rights. They were fighting for the rights of their posterity, which is us, just as much as they were their own. They interposed their own lives between those rights and the radical forces which sought to shackle them and by extension us. Any thinking person should recognize this in an educated society. And if we had an educated society, Americans across the country would honor what they stood for. The legacy of Lincoln is the undoing of Jeffersonian America. It was, in fact, a commission of treason against the Constitution. By the way, to further emphasize the Union, the federal Union, look up the definition of treason in Article 3 of the Constitution. It says, treason against the United States shall consist of making war against them, giving aid and comfort to their enemies. The United States are, plural, a them and a their, not an it or an is. It's not a singular nation. Your own Constitution says that, and surely even a liberal intellectual should be able to read that and understand what it says. So our ancestors undertook to prevent what ultimately became the progressive era. Lincoln was the first progressive president. By destroying the 10th Amendment and the separation of powers, he paved the way and laid the foundation for the progressive era, which has continued to this very day. The Confederate flag and the cause of our ancestors represent the American principles of individual freedom, the right to self-government, and the protection of liberty. You and I are right to honor our ancestors and our cause, regardless of how old-fashioned in our thinking our detractors think we are, because they don't know anything. They don't know what you and I know. Regardless of how much ridicule that they may throw at us in their stupidity, regardless of all these things, you and I were afforded by our ancestors the right to stand here today and proudly proclaim to the entire world, I am Southern and I will not apologize for it. We're Southern by birth, Southern by blood, Southern by tradition, Southern by heritage, and Southern by the grace of Almighty God. Thank you all. God save the South and Merry Christmas.